The courtroom froze as the woman said, "You are my twin sister." The judge, stunned by the words, looked at the defendant in disbelief. They looked strikingly similar: dark eyes, black hair, similar facial features. The judge couldn't understand how this was possible. How could they be twins? The room began to whisper. Was this a provocation, or something more? What do you think this means? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to find out what happens next. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. The air was thick with anticipation as the judge, a woman in her late 40s with a commanding presence, sat at the bench, reviewing the case in front of her. The courtroom had grown quiet, the murmurs of the onlookers fading into the background. The defendant, a woman in her 30s, stood at the center of the room, facing the judge, her expression a mix of defiance and nervous energy. She had been accused of a crime she vehemently denied committing, and as her trial unfolded, the evidence seemed to be stacked against her. The room was waiting for her defense. Suddenly, without warning, the defendant spoke up, her voice cutting through the silence. "You are my twin sister." The words rang out, stark and heavy, sending a ripple of shock through the room. Everyone froze, attorneys, witnesses, and the audience alike. The judge's hand froze mid-motion, the gavel dangling by her side. For a brief moment, time seemed to stop. The judge, her face a mask of professionalism, turned her gaze towards the woman standing before her. She wasn't sure if she had heard correctly, if the defendant had made a mistake or was simply desperate. But there was something in her voice, a certainty, that made the judge pause. The woman's words echoed through the room, and the weight of them settled over her. The judge looked closely at the defendant, trying to see what she had missed before. Both women shared striking features: dark, penetrating eyes that locked onto each other's with an intensity that was almost magnetic. Their skin was a deep shade of rich brown, a hue that spoke of a shared heritage. Their faces, angular yet soft, held the same set of expressions, and there was an undeniable symmetry between them. It was uncanny. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. For a moment, the judge couldn't find her voice. Was this a sick joke? Or was the defendant telling the truth? Could she really be the judge's twin sister? The room was silent, waiting for some kind of reaction. The defense attorney, seeing an opportunity, stood up quickly, trying to seize the moment. "Your Honor, I believe the defendant is revealing something much deeper here, something personal and significant." The judge's eyes never left the defendant's face. She was still grappling with the words, trying to make sense of the overwhelming emotion that bubbled to the surface. In a flash, the memories began to flood her, images from her childhood, moments she had long buried, moments she had pushed away, out of sight and out of mind. It all felt like a dream, too surreal to grasp fully. The defendant continued to stand there, her shoulders squared, her eyes unwavering as they met the judge's. There was no fear in her gaze, just a quiet, resolute determination. This was no mere accusation. This was something far deeper, something that could shatter everything the judge had built in her life. The judge swallowed hard, the weight of the truth beginning to settle in. Could it be possible? Could the woman before her really be the sister she had lost so many years ago? The room was still, the atmosphere heavy with anticipation. The judge finally spoke, her voice steady but filled with disbelief. You're telling me that you are my sister?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the courtroom held its breath. For the first time in years, the judge felt a crack in the facade she had so carefully built, and the truth, though terrifying and unimaginable, began to surface. The courtroom was still reeling from the shock of the defendant's revelation, and yet there was an eerie silence as the judge processed the words. Her heart raced, a strange mix of disbelief and curiosity pulsing through her. She stood still, her mind racing, grappling with the implications of the statement. The woman before her, the defendant, was, in her words, her twin sister, and the resemblance between them was undeniable. The defendant, seeing the judge's confusion, took a slow, steady breath, as if preparing to open a door that had long been locked. She had spent years carrying the weight of this secret, and now, in this courtroom, it seemed like the time had come to finally speak the truth. Her voice, though calm, held an undercurrent of raw emotion. "We were separated when we were just babies," the defendant began, her eyes never leaving the judge's face. "I was taken to a foster home, an orphanage. You were placed with a family who could provide for you, a family with money, with a life full of comforts I could never imagine." The words hung in the air, heavy with history. The judge's mind began to wander back to her childhood, to fragments of memories she had long ago dismissed as insignificant. Her life had been one of privilege, the daughter of a well-off family who had given her everything she could ever want. She had never questioned where she came from, at least, not until now. Her memories of childhood were laced with warmth and safety. But there was something missing, something elusive, a shadow that had always been there but never quite revealed itself. The defendant paused, her gaze softening, as if she understood the struggle the judge was facing. "They took me from you," she continued. "Your family, they told me you were dead. I was just a little girl. I didn't understand, and I thought I had lost you forever." The judge's breath caught in her throat. The words pierced her like a knife, but they were only the beginning. The defendant's voice grew stronger, but still filled with sadness as she shared her story. "I grew up in that orphanage," the defendant said, her eyes briefly flicking away. "It wasn't a bad place, but it wasn't a home. It was a system, and I learned early on how to survive, how to navigate a world that saw me as less than human. The system didn't care about my past or my family. I was just one of many. But I never forgot you. I always felt like there was a part of me missing, like a piece of my soul had been taken away." The judge's chest tightened. She had always wondered if there was something she didn't know, a part of her history that had been hidden. But hearing the defendant's words, hearing the pain in her voice, was a revelation that shattered her understanding of everything she had believed to be true. As the defendant continued, the judge began to remember things she had long buried, fleeting thoughts of childhood dreams, moments of inexplicable loss, a strange sense that something wasn't right, something she couldn't quite place. She had always been told she was the only child, that she was the beloved daughter of a wealthy family, but there was a nagging feeling in her heart that hadn't made sense until now. She had never questioned it before, but now, standing in front of her twin sister, the truth was undeniable. "I was told you died in a fire," the defendant's voice wavered as she spoke the words. "I never knew that you were out there, living a life I could never have dreamed of. I thought I was alone." The judge felt the ground beneath her tremble as the full weight of the defendant's words sank in. She could hear her sister's pain, her abandonment, and she could feel the loss that had haunted her for so many years, even if she hadn't been able to name it before. But there was still one thing that bothered her, something she couldn't fully comprehend. "Why didn't I remember you?" the judge asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She struggled to make sense of the fact that all of these years had passed without her knowing about the twin sister she had lost. "How could I not know?" The defendant sighed deeply, the sadness in her eyes deepening. "They erased you from my memory," she explained softly. "I was told you had died, that I was alone, and I was raised to believe that. But deep down, I never stopped searching for you. Even when I thought I had lost everything, I never gave up on finding my twin sister." The judge closed her eyes, the weight of the past pressing in on her. She had been raised to believe that everything was normal, everything was just as it should be. But the truth, the painful truth, was now clear: her family had kept this secret from her. They had lied to her, erased the memory of her sister, and made her believe she had no one else in the world. The silence in the courtroom was thick with realization, the world outside seeming to blur as the judge faced the truth of her own identity. Her life, her entire sense of self, had been a lie. For the first time, the judge could no longer deny it. The woman standing before her was not just a defendant, she was her sister, her twin, the other half of her soul. And everything, every decision, every memory, was about to change. As the defendant spoke, the courtroom fell into an almost eerie silence. Her words, painful and raw, continued to echo in the judge's mind. It was as though the walls of the room had grown closer, surrounding them both in a suffocating space of untold truths. The contrast between their two lives, the lives that had been shaped by such different fates, was impossible to ignore. The judge had always known that her childhood had been privileged, but she had never truly questioned it until now. Raised in a beautiful home, surrounded by wealth and comfort, she had lived a life many could only dream of. Her parents, successful and influential, had provided her with every opportunity imaginable. Private tutors, the best schools, the finest clothes, everything a child could desire was at her fingertips. There were no hardships, no struggles. She had never known what it was like to go to bed hungry, to face the cruelty of the world without the cushion of wealth to protect her. Her childhood had been filled with laughter, travel, and luxury. Her parents had been loving and attentive, always ensuring she had the best of everything. Her world had been insulated, curated to perfection. Even when difficult moments arose, she had been shielded from the harsh realities that existed beyond the gates of her family's mansion. She had never questioned the fairness of life, and her view of the world was shaped by the privilege she had been born into. But as the defendant continued, describing her own childhood, the judge's world began to unravel. The pain in her sister's voice was clear, each word carrying the weight of years of suffering. The defendant had been abandoned to a system that was indifferent at best and cruel at worst. I grew up in an orphanage, the defendant continued, her voice shaking as she recalled the harshness of her early years. A cold, sterile place where love was a rare commodity. I wasn't given the luxury of a family, of warmth, or even the basic comforts most children take for granted. I learned early on that survival was all that mattered. Her words painted a picture of a starkly different reality. The orphanage was a place where children were treated as mere numbers, where their names were forgotten, and their futures seemed bleak. The defendant described how she was shuffled from one foster home to another, each one colder and more distant than the last. She was never allowed to feel like she belonged anywhere. And though there were other children, they were all bound by the same invisible chains, each one struggling to find a sense of identity in a world that didn't care. I didn't know what love was, the defendant continued, her voice thick with emotion. I didn't know what it meant to have someone look at you and see you for who you were, to care about you. I faced cruelty, neglect, and racism every single day. People saw me as different, less than, because of the color of my skin. I was never allowed to forget that. The judge's heart clenched as the words sank in. While she had been sheltered in her comfortable world, her twin sister had been subjected to the harshness of racism and systemic injustice. The defendant had been forced to endure discrimination and prejudice, from both the system and society, and yet she had survived. But the toll it had taken was evident in every word she spoke. As the defendant continued, she spoke of the racism she had faced in the orphanage, how her darker skin had made her an outsider, even among other children. They never let me forget that I wasn't the same as everyone else, she said bitterly. I wasn't worthy of the same kindness. I wasn't worthy of the same love. The judge, stunned and devastated by the gravity of her sister's experiences, could barely process what she was hearing. She had been blind to the struggles that her own flesh and blood had faced. She had lived a life of unearned comfort, oblivious to the pain that had shaped the woman standing before her. The differences between their two fates couldn't have been more apparent. While the judge had grown up in a world of privilege, given every opportunity to succeed, her sister had been thrust into a life where survival was the only goal. One had been sheltered from the world's cruelty, while the other had been shaped and hardened by it. The judge couldn't help but wonder, how could their lives have diverged so dramatically? What had happened that had led them down such separate paths, and what had been the cost of that separation? "I never even knew you were out there," the defendant said quietly, as if the weight of the truth had finally settled in. "I never knew my twin sister was living a life of comfort, while I was left to fight for every scrap of dignity I could hold on to." The judge swallowed hard, guilt and shame gnawing at her insides. She had never questioned her own good fortune, never wondered why she had been given everything while her sister had been denied even the basic human decency. The difference between their lives was not a mere coincidence, it was the result of a society that had chosen who deserved to be nurtured and who deserved to be forgotten. The defendant paused for a moment, taking a deep breath, before looking directly at the judge. "But here we are. We're standing here, in front of each other, after all these years. And I'm not going to let the world continue to tear us apart." The judge, still reeling from the depth of her sister's suffering, felt something shift inside of her. The truth was undeniable now. She couldn't ignore it. She couldn't pretend that her life had been earned through her own efforts alone. She had been the lucky one, born into a system that had protected her, that had given her everything. And her twin sister had been the one left to fend for herself, cast aside by a world that had no place for her. It was a truth that would change everything. And the judge knew, deep in her heart, that she could no longer turn a blind eye to the injustice that had shaped both of their lives. The weight of the truth was heavy in the air as the defendant's voice echoed through the courtroom. With each passing moment, the accusations against her seemed to become more and more unbearable, a weight she had carried for years. But today, standing in front of the judge, her twin sister, was her chance to finally speak the truth, to reveal the depths of the injustice she had endured. The courtroom was tense. Onlookers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the murmurs of disbelief and confusion filling the space. The defendant had been accused of a crime she knew she didn't commit, but the evidence, though flimsy, had been enough to place her in a position where her fate hung in the balance. She had been wrongfully implicated, a victim of circumstances beyond her control. The crime she stood accused of was one that could destroy her future, yet the truth had always been just out of reach. But now, with her sister, the judge, looking at her, she realized that the time for silence was over. She couldn't let her life be defined by the lies that had been woven around her. It was time to speak, to expose the truth, to finally confront the system that had failed her. The judge, still reeling from the shock of the earlier revelation, stared at the defendant, her eyes searching her face, trying to make sense of the words she had heard. The courtroom had quieted, the air thick with anticipation. The defendant stood tall, her posture unyielding, but her eyes were filled with something deeper, a mixture of pain, defiance, and a fierce determination to set the record straight. "They say I'm guilty," the defendant began, her voice steady despite the emotion swirling within her. "They say I committed a crime. But I'm here to tell you that they're wrong. This is a story of injustice, a story that begins long before I ever set foot in this courtroom." She paused for a moment, her eyes flicking to the judge. She knew her sister, now sitting as the presiding authority in the case, had been raised in a world that had shielded her from the brutal realities of systemic injustice. The judge had lived a life of comfort, untouched by the prejudices that had shaped the defendant's every step. "I didn't do it," the defendant continued, her voice rising with passion. "But do you know what I did do? I survived. I survived a system that never gave me a fair chance. I survived a world that saw me as less than human, simply because of the color of my skin. They never asked the right questions, never cared to know the truth. They just assumed I was guilty, because it's easier to put the blame on someone like me. Someone they think doesn't matter." The courtroom was silent, the truth hanging in the air like a heavy fog. The defendant's words were a gut punch to anyone who had ever denied the deep, pervasive nature of racism. Her life, marked by hardships and battles she had fought alone, was now laid bare for all to see. She wasn't just facing an accusation of a crime she didn't commit, she was confronting a system that had failed her from the very beginning. The judge, struggling to keep her composure, looked at her sister with a mixture of guilt and disbelief. She had spent her life within the confines of a system that had treated her with privilege, a system that had shielded her from the pain and prejudice her sister had endured. And now, as the truth of their shared past began to surface, the reality of what her sister had faced hit her like a tidal wave. The defendant's voice shook slightly as she spoke again. They accused me of a crime because they thought they could get away with it. Because, in their eyes, I was expendable. They never stopped to consider that I might have been innocent. They never stopped to think about the injustice they were perpetuating. It was easier to lock me away than to face the truth of what this world has done to people like me. The judge clenched her fists, the weight of her sister's words sinking deeper into her consciousness. She had never understood the depths of the racism that had shaped her sister's life, but now, as the defendant spoke, it was impossible to ignore. She was not just standing in front of her twin sister, she was standing in front of a woman who had been victimized by a broken system, a system that had decided her sister's fate before she had even had a chance to prove her innocence. The defendant looked directly at the judge, her eyes filled with a sorrow that could no longer be hidden. "I'm not asking for sympathy," she said, her voice quiet but fierce. "I'm asking for justice. For a chance to show you the truth. The truth that's been hidden for so long." For the first time, the judge felt the full weight of what her sister was saying. The years of silence, the years of pain, and the years of injustice that had been ignored, dismissed, and buried deep beneath the surface. And now, here they were, in the same room, forced to confront it all. The defendant's words had opened a floodgate, a torrent of truth that could no longer be ignored. The judge's gaze softened, the realization dawning upon her. She had been blind to the harsh realities her sister had faced, and it was time to face the truth, both about the crime and the system that had failed them both. "This isn't just about me," the defendant finished, her voice steady once more. "This is about everyone who has ever been silenced, ignored, or wrongly accused because of who they are. This is about the fight for justice. And it starts with the truth." The words echoed in the judge's mind like a haunting refrain, "You are my twin sister." They hadn't fully settled in yet, and the weight of them pressed on her chest like a vice. She stared at the defendant, the woman standing before her in the courtroom, her sister, her twin sister, and still, it seemed impossible. How could this be true? How could someone she had never known, someone who had grown up a world apart from her, be the very person she had been missing for so long? The courtroom seemed to blur around her as she tried to make sense of what had just been revealed. Her professional demeanor, honed over years of experience, seemed to falter for the first time in her career. The gravity of the moment left her speechless, her mind racing through fragments of memories, but none of them could make sense of what was unfolding before her. She glanced at the defendant again, at the woman with the same dark eyes, the same angular face, the same warmth that, despite all the pain, still shone through. Their shared features were undeniable. For a moment, the courtroom's noise faded into the background, and all that remained was the image of the defendant. Her sister. The one she didn't even know she had. The judge felt a knot form in her stomach as she stood frozen, trying to reconcile the facts. How is this possible? She could feel the rush of confusion surging through her veins. All her life, she had been told she was an only child. She had been given every privilege, every opportunity. And yet here, in front of her, was this woman, a stranger who spoke as if she knew her, as if they had been separated by some cruel twist of fate. Her thoughts drifted back to her childhood. She had always felt complete, as if there was nothing missing from her life. Her family, though not without their flaws, had always been there for her. She had never once questioned where she came from, who she was, or why her life had unfolded the way it had. She had been given the best education, the finest comforts, and the opportunity to climb the ranks of the legal world. But now, she was starting to doubt everything she thought she knew. Her memories of childhood were mostly peaceful. She had been raised in a beautiful home, with loving parents who shielded her from the harshness of the world. Her life had been a series of well-constructed plans, nothing left to chance. There were occasional moments where she felt restless, perhaps questioning the perfection of her life, but those thoughts had always been fleeting. She had never felt that something was missing, until now. As the judge's gaze lingered on her sister, images began to flash through her mind. Small moments from her past, bits of her childhood she had never given much thought to, now came rushing forward. The old family portraits that had always been displayed proudly on the walls of her house, there were pictures of her parents, of her as a young child, surrounded by friends and family. But then, there were those blank spots in the corners of those photographs, those spaces that felt incomplete. A memory tugged at her, her parents' cryptic comments when she asked about her birth. There had always been a strange hesitation when she brought it up. Her parents would change the subject, brushing her questions off with a vague smile and a quick distraction. She had accepted their answers, never truly pressing further, but now, standing in front of the woman who claimed to be her sister, those odd moments took on new meaning. The defendant's voice broke through the judge's swirling thoughts. "You were always told I died." "But I didn't," she said quietly, her eyes never leaving the judge's face. "You were raised to believe that. They told me you died in a fire, but you were really taken away. Our families were torn apart. I didn't know for years, but I never stopped looking for you." The judge's heart skipped a beat. A fire? Her mind flashed to a distant memory, a conversation she had overheard as a child. Her parents had spoken in hushed tones one evening, voices laced with emotion. She hadn't understood the gravity of it then, but now, it all made sense. They had been hiding something from her, a truth they had kept buried for years. The judge's breath hitched as she struggled to process the magnitude of the revelation. She had never known, never suspected, that she had a sister, let alone a twin. Her whole life had been a lie, a carefully constructed narrative that shielded her from a past she now realized had been stolen from her. "Why didn't I remember you?" the judge asked, her voice trembling slightly, though she was trying to hold on to the control she had always prided herself on. "How could I have forgotten you?" The defendant's face softened, a look of sympathy crossing her features. "They erased you from my life," she said softly. "They told me you were dead. And they told you I didn't exist. They made sure we would never find each other. But I never gave up. I never stopped believing that you were out there." The judge's mind reeled with the implications. Her sister had been left to survive in an orphanage, fighting for every scrap of dignity and love, while she had lived a life of comfort, shielded from the horrors her twin had faced. The stark contrast between their fates was too much to bear, and the guilt that gnawed at her was overwhelming. "I didn't even know you were alive," the judge whispered, her voice barely audible, the weight of the truth settling heavily upon her shoulders. The room was still, and for a moment, the judge allowed herself to look at the woman before her, not as a defendant in her courtroom, but as her twin sister. A sister who had lived an entirely different life, one filled with hardship, pain, and abandonment. And now, they stood together, in the same space, forced to confront a truth that would forever change both of their lives. How could this be possible? How could a life so full of privilege and security coexist with one so filled with pain and injustice? The answer was clear. The world had turned its back on her sister, and the judge had been blind to the truth. But now, standing before her, the truth was undeniable. And the judge knew, deep in her heart, that she could no longer turn away. The weight of the past hung heavily in the air, pressing on the judge with every passing second. She sat at the bench, her eyes fixed on the woman in front of her, her sister. The courtroom around them seemed to disappear, fading into the background as she began to process the revelations that had come to light. This was no longer a case of legal matters, this was her life unraveling before her. The woman who stood accused, her twin sister, was a product of a hidden history, a history the judge had never known. The words spoken in the courtroom seemed to echo in her mind, growing louder with each repetition. You were told I died. They erased me from your life. Those words, the words of her sister, had shaken the very foundation of everything the judge had believed about herself and her family. Her life, so carefully constructed and free of doubt, was now filled with questions. The past she had known felt like a facade, one that had been built on lies and omission. She took a deep breath, the reality of the situation settling in. Why had her family kept this from her? The answer, she now realized, was simple, and yet, it was something she never would have guessed. The truth had been hidden from her because of the prejudices that plagued their society, the same prejudices that had shaped her sister's life and had torn their family apart in the first place. The judge closed her eyes, feeling a wave of shame wash over her. Her family, her parents, had shielded her from the ugly truths of the world. They had kept her protected from the harshness of reality, from the racism and inequality that defined so much of the world her sister had lived in. But in doing so, they had robbed her of the truth about her own flesh and blood. She could almost hear the hushed conversations that must have taken place behind closed doors. "She's better off without knowing," they must have said. "She'll be fine. We'll protect her from the hurt." Her parents had sheltered her from everything, from the painful history of their own past, from the deep-seated prejudice they were so desperate to hide. But in doing so, they had betrayed her. The judge had never questioned her life, her upbringing, because she had never needed to. Everything had been handed to her on a silver platter. But now, as the truth unfurled before her, she saw the price her sister had paid for that same privilege. The defendant, her twin, had been raised in the harsh light of abandonment and systemic cruelty, while she had been shielded from it all. She had lived a life free from the brutality of racism, while her sister had faced it every day. As the judge's thoughts spiraled, memories from her childhood surfaced, disjointed images of family gatherings, moments of warmth, and the fleeting oddities that, at the time, she had dismissed. The secrets had always been there, hidden in plain sight. Why hadn't she seen it before? The question gnawed at her, the realization of how easily she had accepted the narrative that had been fed to her. Her parents had never spoken about the hardships that came with being black in a world full of prejudice. They had never mentioned the sister who had been taken from her, erased by the very same system they had benefited from. The privilege she had grown up with was so vast, so deeply entrenched, that she had never thought to question it. She looked at the defendant again, her twin sister, and for the first time, truly saw her. This woman, standing before her, was the other half of her, the part of her life that had been lost, the piece of her past that had been hidden from her. The bond they shared was undeniable, but so much of it had been torn away by the very prejudices their family had sought to avoid confronting. The judge's gaze softened, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had learned. The defendant, her sister, had been forced to live a life of pain, of rejection, all because of a system built on racial inequality. The family that had raised her, the family she had trusted, had kept her ignorant of the truth to protect themselves from the uncomfortable reality of race and its impact on their lives. "I didn't know," the judge whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. The words felt like an admission of guilt, as though she had been complicit in the very injustices her sister had faced. "I didn't know." The defendant, her twin sister, watched her, her face unreadable. "They didn't want you to know," she said quietly. "They didn't want you to see the truth. They wanted to keep you safe from the world they knew would tear you apart. But in doing so, they tore us apart." The judge's chest tightened. She thought of her parents, the people she had trusted, who had made decisions for her without her knowledge. Their intentions had been to protect her, to shield her from a world that could be cruel, but in the process, they had stripped her of the truth about her own sister. She could feel the deep hurt her twin had carried for all those years. And now, as the truth came to light, the judge could no longer stay silent. "I'm so sorry," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "I didn't know. But I will make it right. I swear I will." For the first time in a long while, the judge felt a sense of purpose, a drive to seek justice, not just for her sister, but for herself. The road ahead would be difficult. It would be full of uncomfortable truths and difficult realizations. But she was ready to face them, ready to confront the history her family had hidden and the wrongs that had been done. And, for the first time, the judge knew that the truth would set them both free. The days following the courtroom revelation were filled with a storm of emotions that the judge had never anticipated. What began as a typical day at the bench had transformed into something far deeper, more personal, than she could have ever imagined. Her twin sister, the defendant, stood before her, no longer just a stranger accused of a crime, but family. Her blood, her flesh, the woman she had been separated from and unknowingly forgotten for all these years. The weight of it all pressed on her chest, and the judge found herself struggling to regain her composure. She had spent a lifetime upholding the law, standing firm as the impartial arbiter of justice. But now, standing in this very courtroom, it was impossible to ignore the pull of personal truth that demanded to be heard. She had always believed that the law was black and white, that right and wrong could be defined by evidence and reason. But now, as she looked at her twin sister, the lines were no longer so clear. The defendant, her sister, was being accused of a crime she did not commit, a crime that, if convicted, would shatter her future. But the judge now knew something that the court did not. She knew the truth, and she could no longer stay silent. As much as her professional duty told her to remain neutral, her heart, torn between family and duty, was telling her something else. Justice, true justice, required more than just following the law. It required the truth. It was late one evening when the judge found herself alone in her office, the silence weighing heavily on her. The courtroom had cleared out for the day, the echoes of the trial still reverberating in her mind. She couldn't shake the image of her twin sister, standing strong, despite everything she had endured, despite the injustice that had shaped her life. The judge's mind kept returning to the same question: how could I let this happen? Her sister had faced so much pain, so much hardship, and yet it was her life that was being questioned in a court of law. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft click of the door opening. She turned to see her sister standing there, looking tired but determined. The weight of the world seemed to hang on her shoulders, but there was a fire in her eyes, an unwavering resolve that the judge admired. "I know what you're thinking," her sister said quietly, stepping into the room. "You don't have to do this. You don't have to stand by me. You've worked so hard to get where you are, and I'm just the woman accused of a crime I didn't commit." The judge's heart ached at the sound of her sister's voice. There was so much pain in those words, so much of the hurt that had been buried for years. But there was something else, too, a deep trust in her eyes, a trust that had been forged in the depths of their shared blood, even if they had been kept apart for so long. "You're not just the woman accused of a crime," the judge replied softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "You are my sister. And I will not let you face this alone." Her sister's eyes widened, a flicker of disbelief crossing her face. "But, what about everything? What about the system? The law? How can you stand by me, when everything is stacked against me?" The judge took a deep breath, the weight of the decision now resting squarely on her shoulders. She had known, deep down, that this moment would come. She had known that the truth, painful and uncomfortable as it was, would demand that she make a choice. A choice between staying loyal to a broken system or standing up for her family, for her sister, who had been wronged by that very system. "I've spent my whole life believing in the law," the judge said slowly, her eyes meeting her sister's. "But I've realized that the law alone isn't enough. It's not enough if it ignores the truth, if it condemns innocent people. The law is supposed to serve justice, but if it's built on lies, then it's broken. I can't stand by that. Not anymore." Her sister was silent, absorbing the words. The judge could see the weight of her sister's doubts beginning to lift. The years of mistrust, the years of questioning her place in a world that had forsaken her, were finally starting to fade, replaced by the truth that had been buried for so long. The judge stood, her hands steady despite the turmoil she felt inside. She walked over to her sister, placing a hand on her shoulder, firm, supportive, and unwavering. "I don't care what anyone says," she continued. "I will fight for you. I will fight for the truth. You are my sister, and no matter what the world says, I will always stand by you." Tears welled in her sister's eyes, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. The bond between them, one that had been severed for so long, yet still remained intact, was stronger than anything the judge had ever felt in her life. This was her family. This was her blood. "Thank you," her sister whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for seeing me. For seeing the truth." The judge nodded, her heart swelling with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. "This is just the beginning," she said, her voice steady now, full of resolve. "We're going to make this right. We're going to uncover the truth, no matter what it takes." As she turned to face the courtroom again, ready to make her move, the judge knew that nothing would ever be the same. The case was no longer about a defendant, it was about her sister, her twin, and the truth that had been hidden for far too long. The world had tried to tear them apart, but now, together, they would fight for justice. The days following her decision to stand by her sister were filled with a deep internal conflict that threatened to consume the judge. She had spent her entire life adhering to a strict moral code, believing that the law was the ultimate arbiter of truth and justice. But now, standing at the crossroads of her career and her family, everything she had been taught, everything she had come to trust, was being called into question. Every time she walked into her courtroom, she was reminded of the weight of the decision she was facing. The gavel in her hand felt heavier than it ever had before. She wasn't just presiding over a case, she was entangled in a web of personal and professional responsibilities. Her sister, the woman she had unknowingly lost all those years ago, was standing trial for a crime she didn't commit. And the judge, her own flesh and blood, was expected to oversee the proceedings, to ensure that justice was served. But how could she fulfill that duty when she knew her sister was innocent? How could she sit in judgment, knowing that the evidence against her was based on a system designed to fail people like her? The very system that had torn them apart in the first place. The judge had always believed that the law was impartial, that it would always work in favor of justice. But now, faced with a case that challenged everything she had stood for, the cracks in that belief were beginning to show. The judge had always been a pillar of her community, respected for her unwavering commitment to justice. She had built a reputation as someone who would never compromise on principle, who would always follow the law, no matter the personal cost. But now, she was standing at the precipice of a decision that could shatter everything she had worked for. If she chose to support her sister, if she allowed her personal feelings to influence the outcome, she risked not only her career but her very integrity. Could she really let her own flesh and blood get away with a crime she hadn't committed? Could she truly allow herself to break the rules that had defined her life? The stakes were high, and the pressure was mounting. Every day, the judge felt the tension rise within her. Her sister had entrusted her with the truth, the painful truth that had been hidden for so long. She had revealed her deepest pain, the suffering of a lifetime of abandonment, racism, and injustice. And the judge knew, deep in her heart, that her sister was telling the truth. But how could she reconcile that with her duty as a judge? How could she stand by and let the legal process unfold when she knew that the system was flawed, that it had failed her sister time and time again? There were moments when the judge would sit alone in her chambers, her head in her hands, the weight of the world bearing down on her. She thought of her sister, her twin, standing in the defendant's box, vulnerable, exposed, fighting for her life in a system that had no regard for the truth. She thought of the years her sister had spent in the orphanage, the cruelty she had endured, and the unspoken history that had been erased from both of their lives. The judge could no longer ignore it. She could no longer pretend that the law was enough. She had seen the cracks in the foundation, and now she had to decide whether to stand by the system that had always protected her or fight for her sister and the truth. One evening, after another long day in court, the judge found herself alone in the quiet of her office. The weight of the decision hung over her like a dark cloud, pressing her into the chair. Her fingers hovered over the case file in front of her, her sister's fate, her own future, all contained within those pages. She could see the evidence, the flawed testimony, the glaring inconsistencies that had led to her sister's wrongful accusation. She could hear her sister's voice in her mind, hear her plead for justice, for someone, anyone, to believe her. She felt a sudden surge of anger rise within her. How had the system become so broken? How had she, a judge who had dedicated her life to upholding the law, become so blind to the inequities that plagued it? The defendant, her sister, had been accused of a crime she didn't commit, all because of a system that had labeled her guilty before she even had a chance. And now, the judge had to decide whether to stay silent, to follow the law as she always had, or to fight against it, to stand up for the truth that had been buried for far too long. Her thoughts turned to her parents, the same parents who had kept the truth from her all these years. She had grown up in a house of privilege, shielded from the harsh realities of racism, but now, she saw it all too clearly. Her family had hidden the truth from her, protected her from the pain, but in doing so, they had kept her from seeing the world as it truly was. She had been raised to believe in the fairness of the system, but now, faced with the injustice in front of her, she realized just how deeply that system was flawed. The judge knew what she had to do. She had always prided herself on her integrity, on her ability to remain impartial. But she couldn't ignore the truth any longer. She couldn't let her sister stand alone in the face of an unjust system. It was time to make a choice. With a deep breath, the judge picked up the case file and began to review it again, this time with a different perspective. She would not let her sister suffer. She would not let her sister be condemned by a system that had failed her from the start. The decision was clear. The judge stood, the weight of the choice heavy on her shoulders, but her heart was resolute. The time for silence had passed. She would stand by her sister, no matter the cost. The truth would be revealed, and justice would be served, no matter the consequences. The judge stood at a crossroads, the weight of her decision pressing down on her with each passing second. For years, she had upheld the law, trusted in its ability to deliver justice. But now, standing before her sister, her twin, the reality of the situation was undeniable. The law had failed them both, and the truth needed to be heard. Her sister had suffered, not only from the crime she was accused of but from a lifetime of systemic injustice and racial prejudice. The judge could no longer remain silent, bound by the legal constraints that had shielded her from the truth for so long. She had spent too many years blind to the world her sister had endured, a world shaped by bias and discrimination. With a firm resolve, the judge stood before the courtroom, her voice steady as she declared, "The truth must be known." She turned to her sister, offering a reassuring glance. The moment had arrived. The truth about their past, the truth about the racism and injustice that had torn them apart, would no longer be hidden. The judge called for the case to be reopened, knowing that revealing this truth would change everything. It would risk her career, but it would also bring justice, not just for her sister, but for every life that had been touched by prejudice. The time for silence was over. The truth would be set free. The courtroom was electric with anticipation. Every eye in the room was fixed on the judge as she rose from her seat, the weight of the decision pressing on her shoulders. The room, once filled with tension and uncertainty, now felt charged with the electricity of hope. The air was thick with expectation. On one side, the defendant stood, exhausted but resolute, her fate hanging in the balance. On the other, the judge, no longer just a legal authority, but a woman who had risked everything to stand up for the truth. After the judge's impassioned statement about the systemic racism and the injustice her sister had faced, the room had erupted into whispers, some of admiration, others of disbelief. The legal community had never seen such a bold move from a judge before. To openly challenge the system, to use her position not just to interpret the law but to correct its wrongs, was unprecedented. Many had wondered whether she would follow through, whether the pressure would force her to back down. But she stood firm, unwavering in her belief that her duty was not only to the law, but to the truth. As the defense and prosecution made their final arguments, the judge listened intently, her mind focused on the case, but also on the weight of the consequences. She knew this moment would change everything, not just for her sister, but for herself, her career, and the integrity of the judicial system. It wasn't just about proving the defendant's innocence anymore, it was about exposing the deep-seated racism that had allowed her to be accused in the first place. It was about confronting the reality of a system that perpetuated inequality and forced people to fight for their basic rights, simply because of their skin color. The jury deliberated, the room falling into a tense silence. Minutes stretched into hours, the tension building until it was almost unbearable. The defendant, her face pale but resolute, stood by her sister, now a beacon of support in the storm. The judge, though calm outwardly, felt her pulse quicken, her thoughts a whirlwind of emotions, hope, fear, anticipation. She had given everything for this moment. There was no turning back now. Finally, the moment arrived. The jury returned to the courtroom, the foreman holding the piece of paper that would decide the defendant's fate. The room held its breath as the foreman spoke. "Not guilty." The words rang out, clear and resounding. A wave of shock, then relief, rippled through the courtroom. The defendant, her eyes filling with tears, collapsed into her sister's arms. The truth had won. The weight of years of injustice, of racial prejudice, of a system that had almost condemned her, had been lifted in that single moment. She was free. And the judge, who had risked everything to ensure that truth prevailed, could finally allow herself to breathe again. The courtroom erupted into applause, the sound of victory reverberating through the space. But for the judge, the moment was bittersweet. She had fought for this outcome, but the cost had been great. Her career was forever changed. She had made an enemy of the very system she had once been a part of, and there would be no going back. But in her heart, she knew it had been worth it. The truth had been revealed, and her sister, her twin, had been freed from a false accusation. Outside the courtroom, the media descended like a storm, microphones and cameras thrust into the judge's face. The questions came fast and furious, but the judge remained composed, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of attention. She knew that this moment, this victory, was bigger than herself. It was a symbol of the fight against systemic racism, a testament to the power of truth in the face of oppression. "I stood by my sister," the judge said, her voice carrying through the chaos. "But this is not just about one case. This is about a system that needs to change. We cannot ignore the truth any longer. We cannot continue to allow prejudice to shape our justice system." Today, truth won. But the fight is not over. Her words resonated beyond the courtroom, capturing the attention of the public. News outlets around the world covered the story of the judge who had risked everything to reveal the truth about racism and injustice. People took to social media, sharing her message of hope and calling for change. She had become a symbol, not just of justice, but of the unwavering commitment to fight for what was right, no matter the cost. The judge knew that the road ahead would be difficult. There would be those who would try to tear her down, to discredit her actions. But in her heart, she felt something she had never felt before: peace. The decision she had made, to stand by her sister and expose the truth, had changed her. It had opened her eyes to the reality of a world that needed to be reformed, a world where justice was not a privilege, but a right for all. As she left the courthouse, her sister by her side, the judge felt a deep sense of pride. She had done what was right. She had fought for her family, for truth, and for justice. And in that moment, she knew that whatever the future held, she had made a difference. What did you think of this story? Was it surprising how the judge stood by her sister and exposed the truth? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories about justice, truth, and the fight against injustice.